I already am eating from the trash bin all the time.
When Žižek arrived on the scene in 1989 with his book, The Sublime Object of Ideology, the Berlin Wall had just come down, and Francis Fukuyama's essay, The End of History, had just been received with open arms by the neoconservative U.S. establishment. Everyone agreed that Marx was dead and ideological struggle was over.
This is a time when the future seems a door you can walk right through, into a room called tomorrow. For the first time in perhaps all history, man does not have to invent a system by which to live. We don't have to talk late into the night about which form of government is better. We don't have to wrest justice from the kings. We only have to summon it from within ourselves. We must act on what we know.
The point is that really existing communism had just died, and Žižek, who had been moldering in communist Yugoslavia, was finally free to pursue his sublime object. Perhaps perversely, Žižek's first masterpiece was a sort of half-step towards a return to Marx, as it was a refutation of post-structuralism or postmodernism while being an embrace of what he called post-Marxism. In this way, Žižek was both ahead of and out of step with his time, or at least out of step with my development. He launched his first salvo against postmodernism before I'd even heard of Derrida, and a few years later, when I was discovering Richard Linklater's Slacker, Hal Foster's The Anti-Ascetic, and Sadie Plant's The Most Radical Gesture, the Situationist International in a Postmodern Age. And while Plant, Fisher, and Nick Land were forming their cybernetic culture research unit, Žižek was writing books such as Looking Awry, which he called a defense of dialectical totalization against the fragmentation that prevails in postmodern theory. While I was embracing Pomo and anarchism, he was slowly returning to Marx, or at least to Hegel, through Lacan. Today, Žižek is a supporter of Zero Books, or at least of some of our authors. For instance, he recently blurbed Ideology in the Virtual City. He wrote, "Video games are gradually recognized as a new cultural form which reaches far beyond mere entertainment. They enact new forms of subjectivity and temporality. However, this fascination with the new form should not render us blind for the fact that, in their content, even at its most magic, video games are firmly rooted in our neoliberal capitalism and faithfully mirror its antimonies." Given that video games are the new cultural form, the newest symptom of our neoliberal society, we'll turn to one of them as we explain Žižek. However, I want to clarify something first. I just said that Žižek's sublime object was a salvo against post-structuralism. But it wasn't just that. Žižek can never contain himself to one target. For instance, at the start of the book, in his introduction, Žižek took aim not at post-structuralism, but at another critic of post-structuralism, or postmodernism, namely Jürgen Habermas. Why did Žižek critique a critic of his supposed intended target? To answer that, we have to have at least some understanding of what both Žižek and Habermas were criticizing. That is, we have to at least try to understand what post-structuralism and/or postmodernism is. Now, this is the part where we bring up the video game, specifically the 2011-2012 interactive storytelling and walking simulator, The Stanley Parable. In the Stanley Parable, you play an office drone named Stanley, whose humdrum, perhaps even inhumanly boring life is interrupted one day when his computer stops providing him with the usual instructions that direct his activities, and when he notices that the gigantic office building he's working in is empty. Alone at work, Stanley sets off to discover what has happened and he is confronted by an existential dilemma. The world he takes to be real is unreal, and what is worse, the freedom he thinks or thought he enjoyed is unreal as well. Rather than being a free man working in a natural world on a job he has freely chosen to do, he is instead a puppet directed by the voice of a narrator, a voice that he heard all along, but is made distinct from his own inner voice when he starts to disobey its orders. Once Stanley gets off track, once he stops taking directions, he discovers that the world doesn't make sense. The space he's been in isn't consistent, but is an Escher-like maze that moves as he moves. Now, I've chosen the Stanley Parable to illustrate the ideas of both Slavoj Žižek and the post-structuralists, because as an overtly philosophical game that forces the player to confront epistemic and metaphysical problems, it is a game that seems built for critical theorists. In an essay analyzing the film The Matrix in 1999, Zizek asked, "Is this film not one of the films which function as a kind of Rorschach test, setting in motion the universalized process of recognition, like the proverbial painting of God, which seems always to stare directly at you from wherever you look at it? Practically every orientation seems to recognize itself in this film." So I'll paraphrase Žižek here and say that the Stanley Parable is much like the Matrix. It can be taken from multiple perspectives as well. I too can imagine that an Althusserian might be sure that the game's developers had read Althusser on interpolation. I can picture Frankfurt School fans finding a critique of the culture industry in it. New Agers might find that it fits with their view that the world is just a mirage generated by a global mind. Doesn't the Stanley Parable repeat exactly Plato's allegory of the cave? What all of these different approaches to the Stanley Parable would have in common, though, is that they are all attempts to solve the problem of perception, or to put it in a different way, to come to terms with subjectivity. As human beings, we appear to be trapped in our own heads, be cut off from any direct experience of the objective world, and thereby cut off from any direct or natural way to live in the world. Slavoj Žižek's Sublime Object of Ideology is part of a very long series of attempts to come to terms with or overcome this very hard problem of subjectivity. Specifically, it is coming on the scene at the moment when a number of philosophers have attempted to stop trying to answer the question or to solve the problem. A bit like the computer in the old 80s movie War Games, who decides not to start a nuclear war because the game of nuclear war is unwinnable. Philosophers had decided that overcoming the problem of subjectivity was impossible, and that the best that could be done was to investigate and systematize our perceptions without any reference to the outside world. The post-structuralists, as critics of structuralism, had determined that this effort to know our own system of cognition was likewise impossible. What Derrida argued was that the structuralists could no more claim to understand the system that determines our language and ideas objectively than anyone could claim to understand the outside world. Put a different way, Derrida noted that the universal fixed substance that philosophers were questing after before hadn't been done away with by the structuralists, but rather that it had been transformed into speech, into spoken words, which, however arbitrarily, the structuralists associated with fixed and given meanings. In fact, the link between a sign, the sound image, and the signifier, the mental concept, could never be fully established, in just the same way that our subjective experiences can never be shown to be linked or to correspond with an outside world. Neither could the meaning of a given spoken or written word be ascertained. Now, in order to understand Habermas's objection to Derrida, in order to see just what Žižek starts off critiquing, we're going to return to the Stanley Parable. What Habermas points out in his critique of Derrida is that despite this objection that we can't know whether or not our words have meaning, we are nonetheless experiencing a problem. At the risk of stretching the metaphor, Habermas says that Derrida is ignoring that the orders are no longer coming, and that the world has been exposed as unreal, that we are tasked with being free. Derrida might think that we've reached a moment wherein reason and striving could give way to merely following our tastes or feelings, but this would constitute a regression. We can no more simply act on our natural feelings and tastes today than Stanley can return to pressing the buttons his computer commands him to press. In fact, because we now know that to return to pressing buttons will be our choice, we would still be in the same predicament of freedom and uncertainty that we started in. And it's this argument from Habermas that Žižek wants to argue against. In his Sublime Object of Ideology, Žižek writes, "With Habermas, we have the ethics of the unbroken communication, the ideal of the universal, transparent, intersubjective community. The notion of the subject behind this, of course, is the philosophy of language version of the old subject of transcendental reflection." Now, this is actually pretty damning, because the ethics of unbroken communication that is transparent and intersubjective is, of course, a failed ethics because it relies on the assumption of a world beyond us, which we assume to know directly. A world where the commands from the computer make sense. A world that is natural. The subject of transcendental reflection is from Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Kant wrote, "Reflection does not concern itself with objects themselves with a view to deriving concepts from them directly, but is that state of mind in which we first set ourselves to discover the subjective conditions under which alone we are able to arrive at concepts. And transcendental reflection is the aspect of our subjectivity that determines where a given subjective representation belongs. So, for instance, we have a thought of a duck, and we use our transcendental reflection to determine whether we are experiencing the mere concept of a duck with the part of our cognition system that deals with concepts, or whether this duck is a product of our senses, and therefore whether or not we might give it a few breadcrumbs. By referring to the philosophy of language version of the transcendental subject, Žižek is pointing out how Habermas has merely returned to the structuralism that Derrida and others have overturned. This transcendental reflection can no more easily determine a duck of sensation from a duck of the imagination or of the concept than we can easily determine what is really in the world beyond us and what is only in our heads. To put it a different way, what Žižek notices is that the imperatives to win the game, as we've known it, really have vanished. We cannot know the world directly. The orders have stopped coming, now that the rest of the employees have disappeared, and we are, in fact, stuck in a video game. We can't continue to play as we have before. We can't return to our old project of modernity, because intersubjectivity doesn't work without the assumption of access to objectivity. What Žižek will do instead, as we get past the first few paragraphs of his introduction, is break from Habermas's Kantian refutation of Derrida. That is, Žižek will neither embrace Derrida's turn away from the game we're stuck in, a turn that ends up being a kind of acceptance, nor try to win it as it is, but rather what he'll try to do is discover what there might be about our predicament, there might be in this experience of disorientation that could provide us with some footing. It's this desire to overcome both Habermas's flat-footed acceptance of the idea of beating the Stanley Parable and Derrida's insistence that we should just subjectively and intuitively react to it that Žižek will attempt to get beyond. Žižek will try to discover the sublime object, or that objective fact that is neither directly accessible to us and thus identical with us, with our finite, fallible, one-sided subjectivity, nor the object which we intuit and enjoy only for as long as we can defer understanding its meaning. Well, this video turned out to be a bit more Žižekian than I had originally intended. In other words, it was very philosophical and jam-packed full of references. I'm not saying it was as good as Žižek, but in the future, in the next video in this series. I'll return to thinking about Marx as I evaluate the first chapter here, or really the first section, which is called How Did Marx Invent the Symptom? And it starts out with an analysis of Marx's notion of the commodity fetish, or of the commodity. And I look forward to jumping in on Žižek's interpretation and probably objecting. But I look forward to taking a close look at Žižek's interpretation of Marx's notion of the commodity and of the commodity fetish. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.